Maria Gonzalez had always dreamed of owning a home. Growing up in a small village in Mexico, the idea of having a place to call her own seemed like a distant fantasy. Her family struggled to make ends meet, and the concept of property ownership was reserved for the wealthy. But Maria was determined. She worked tirelessly, saving every penny, and when she finally moved to the United States, she carried that dream with her. After years of hard work, Maria's dream came true. She purchased a modest house on Maplewood Lane, a quiet street in a suburban neighborhood. The house wasn't perfect, it needed some repairs, and the yard was overgrown. But to Maria, it was a palace. It was hers. She had paid for it in full, every dollar earned through years of sacrifice and perseverance. The house represented stability, safety, and freedom, things she had never known growing up. Maria quickly made the house her own. She painted the walls in warm, inviting colors, planted a garden in the backyard, and filled the rooms with furniture that reminded her of home. The house became a sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe freely and dream without fear. But Maria's dream was about to be shattered. It started with a letter. Maria found it in her mailbox one afternoon, tucked between a stack of bills and advertisements. The envelope was addressed to her, but the return address was unfamiliar. Maplewood Homeowners Association, HOA. Maria frowned. She had never heard of an HOA in her neighborhood. When she bought the house, the previous owner had assured her that there were no HOA obligations tied to the property. The house was built decades before the HOA was established, and it sat just outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Maria had no reason to believe she was part of any homeowners association. She opened the letter and read it carefully. It was a notice of violation, citing her for an unapproved garden shed and improper lawn maintenance. The letter demanded that she pay a fine of $200 and bring her property into compliance with HOA standards within 30 days. Maria was confused. She didn't have a garden shed, and her lawn was perfectly maintained. She had spent countless hours tending to her yard, planting flowers, and trimming the hedges. She decided to ignore the letter, assuming it was a mistake or some kind of scam. But the letters kept coming. Every week, a new notice would arrive in her mailbox, each one more threatening than the last. The fines piled up, and the HOA began to demand monthly dues of $450. Maria couldn't understand why she was being targeted. She had never agreed to join the HOA, and her property wasn't even part of their community. Maria's life was already hectic. As a small business owner, she spent most of her time juggling client projects, managing employees, and traveling to meet new contracts. Her days were consumed with endless responsibilities, and she often spent weeks out of town. Her house, once a source of pride, became a place she barely had time to enjoy. But even amidst the chaos, Maria's neighbors proved to be a source of quiet comfort and unexpected kindness. Victor, a retired firefighter who lived 2 doors down, took it upon himself to clear her mailbox when she was away. "Can't have it overflowing," he'd say with a wink. "Makes it look like no one's home." Across the street, Bill and his wife, Maria, tended to their immaculate rose garden. They would often wave at Maria when she returned from her trips, and sometimes she'd find her lawn freshly mowed, the crisp lines of the cut grass a silent reminder that someone cared enough to lend a hand. Maria appreciated the gestures, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The HOA letters continued to arrive, and the fines were now in the thousands of dollars. She tried to ignore them, but the nagging sense of unease grew with each passing day. One morning, Maria received a call from Victor. His voice was trembling. "Maria, you need to come home. There's a notice taped to your door saying your house has been sold." Maria's heart dropped. She thought it had to be a mistake. How could anyone sell a home she had fully paid for without her permission? She immediately rushed back home, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as she replayed Victor's words in her mind. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw the notice fluttering in the wind. It was real. Her house had been sold at a foreclosure auction due to unpaid HOA dues and fines. Maria was devastated. She had no idea this was happening. She had never received any official notifications, and she had never agreed to join the HOA. Maria reached out to the company that had purchased her home and learned they had acquired it for a mere fraction of its value. The new owner demanded she either leave in a month's time or pay rent to stay in her own home. Maria was crushed. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen without her knowledge or consent. Maria was determined not to let the HOA take her home without a fight. She reached out to Victor, who suggested she consult his cousin, Eleanor, a local attorney with a reputation for taking on tough cases. Maria met with Eleanor, who quickly realized that the HOA had acted illegally. Maria's property wasn't even part of their jurisdiction, and they had no legal claim to it. Eleanor and Maria began strategizing. They needed every shred of evidence, property records, tax maps, and correspondence with the HOA. Maria spent long nights combing through old files, desperately hoping to find something that would tip the scales in her favor. It was exhausting, but with every piece of evidence unearthed, she felt a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, Maria's neighbors rallied around her. Victor, Bill, Maria, and even Mr. Johnson, the self-proclaimed historian of the neighborhood, offered their support. They shared stories, gathered evidence, and even volunteered to testify in court. Their kindness and solidarity gave Maria the strength to keep fighting. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Maria felt like a bundle of nerves. As she entered the courtroom, she saw Karen, the HOA president, sitting confidently at the plaintiff's table. Karen's crisp suit and smug expression radiated arrogance. Maria's heart sank as she thought about the power imbalance between them. Karen represented an established institution with deep pockets, while Maria was just one person fighting to hold on to her home. The hearing began with opening statements. Eleanor was sharp and articulate, painting a picture of an overreaching HOA that had trampled on Maria's rights. Karen's attorney argued that the HOA had acted within its authority, emphasizing the unpaid dues and abandoned state of Maria's property. The turning point came when Eleanor presented the tax map. She walked up to the judge's bench with a large printout, pointing out the clear boundaries of the HOA and the exclusion of Maria's property. "Your Honor, this is indisputable proof that my client's property falls outside the HOA's jurisdiction," she said, her voice steady. Any actions taken by the HOA regarding this property were not only inappropriate, but illegal. Karen's expression shifted from smug to nervous. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering furiously, but there was nothing they could say to refute the evidence. The judge examined the map closely, his brow furrowing as he asked Karen, "Did you verify the property status before initiating foreclosure?" Karen stammered, her previously confident demeanor unraveling. We assumed," she admitted reluctantly. The judge interrupted, his tone sharp. "This court does not operate on assumptions, Miss Karen. Your actions have caused significant harm to the defendant, and it appears you did so without proper legal standing." Eleanor seized the moment, presenting testimony from Victor and Maria, who recounted their interactions with the HOA and confirmed that no one had ever abandoned the property. When Mr. Johnson took the stand, he shared historical details about the neighborhood and exposed Karen's long history of overreach. His testimony was both damning and oddly entertaining, his fiery delivery causing a few chuckles in the courtroom. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the judge was not impressed with the HOA's actions. In his final ruling, he not only gave Maria her house back and dismissed the HOA's claims, but also declared their actions illegal and awarded Maria damages for harassment and emotional distress. The legal ruling sent shockwaves through the community. News of the HOA's defeat spread quickly, and Karen's once unshakable authority was shattered. The judge's scathing reprimand during the trial had humiliated her, and the local paper wasted no time picking up the story. The headline read, "HOA President Overreaches, Loses Big in Court." Karen's fall from grace was swift and severe. She resigned as HOA president, and the community began to question whether the HOA was even necessary. Many residents called for a full audit of the HOA's operations, and new leadership brought a more balanced approach to the organization. For Maria, the victory was bittersweet. She had reclaimed her home, but the experience had left her disillusioned. She eventually decided to sell the house and move to a new neighborhood, one without an HOA. As she stood in the doorway of her new home, she took a deep breath and let the crisp air fill her lungs. This place was different, smaller, quieter, and tucked away from the prying eyes of homeowners associations. It wasn't as grand as the house she had lost, but it felt like a fresh start. Maria stayed in touch with her old neighbors, visiting occasionally and exchanging letters with Victor and Maria. Each visit reminded her of how far she'd come and how much she'd grown. The pain of losing her home had faded, replaced by a sense of gratitude for the lessons it had taught her. Looking back, Maria realized that the house wasn't the real victory. It was the courage she found within herself, the connections she strengthened with those around her, and the knowledge that even in the face of adversity, she could endure. The house had been a chapter in her life, but it wasn't the whole story. Maria's new life in her bungalow was peaceful, but it didn't take long for the past to catch up with her. One crisp autumn morning, as she sipped her coffee on the porch, she noticed a familiar-looking envelope in her mailbox. Her heart sank as she pulled it out and saw the return address, Maplewood Homeowners Association, HOA. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. The letter inside was from the new HOA president, a man named Richard Thompson. It stated that the HOA had reviewed their records and discovered that Maria's former property on Maplewood Lane was, in fact, within their jurisdiction after all. The letter demanded that she pay the outstanding fines and dues, which now amounted to over $10,000, or face legal action. Maria was furious. She had already fought this battle and won. How could they come after her again? She immediately called Eleanor, her attorney, who was equally outraged. "This is harassment," Eleanor said firmly. "They can't just ignore the court's ruling. We'll fight this, Maria. Don't worry." But Maria couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in her chest. She had worked so hard to move on, and now the HOA was dragging her back into their web of bureaucracy and intimidation. Maria decided to visit her old neighborhood to gather more information. As she drove down Maplewood Lane, she was struck by how much had changed. The once vibrant street now felt subdued, with several houses sporting for sale signs. The community garden she had helped plant was overgrown, and the playground where children used to laugh was eerily quiet. She stopped by Victor's house, and he greeted her with a warm hug. "It's good to see you, Maria," he said, but his smile faded when she showed him the letter. "They're at it again," he muttered, shaking his head. "Ever since Karen left, the new board has been trying to clean up her mess, but they're just as bad. They're desperate for money, and they're going after anyone they think they can squeeze." Victor introduced Maria to some of the other neighbors, many of whom were also facing new HOA fines and threats. It seemed the HOA was targeting anyone who had ever had a dispute with them, trying to recoup their losses after the court ruling. Maria felt a surge of anger. She had fought for her home once, and she wasn't about to let the HOA bully her or anyone else again. Maria decided to take action. She organized a meeting at Victor's house, inviting all the neighbors who had been affected by the HOA's aggressive tactics. The turnout was impressive. Nearly every household on Maplewood Lane was represented. As Maria stood in front of the group, she felt a sense of determination. "We've all been through enough," she said. "The HOA thinks they can push us around, but we're stronger together. We need to stand up to them, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." The neighbors nodded in agreement, and soon they were brainstorming ideas. Some suggested forming a legal defense fund, while others proposed launching a public awareness campaign to expose the HOA's abuses. Maria even reached out to a local journalist who had covered her previous case, hoping to bring more attention to the issue. As the meeting wrapped up, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her community. The journalist, a young woman named Sarah, was eager to help. She published a scathing article about the HOA's tactics, detailing how they were targeting longtime residents with baseless fines and threats. The story quickly went viral, sparking outrage across the country. News crews descended on Maplewood Lane, interviewing residents and shining a spotlight on the HOA's abuses. Maria found herself at the center of the storm, giving interviews and sharing her story. She was nervous at first, but as she spoke, she felt a sense of empowerment. She was no longer a victim, she was a fighter. The media attention put immense pressure on the HOA. Richard Thompson, the new president, tried to defend their actions, but his excuses fell flat. "We're just trying to enforce the rules," he said in one interview, but the public wasn't buying it. The hashtag HOA stories began trending on social media, with people from all over the country sharing their own experiences with abusive homeowners associations. With the media spotlight on them, the HOA backed off for a while. But Maria knew they weren't done. She and Eleanor continued to prepare for the legal battle, gathering evidence and building their case. They discovered that the HOA had been forging documents and manipulating records to justify their actions. It was a shocking revelation, but it gave Maria the ammunition she needed. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Maria felt a mix of nerves and determination. As she walked into the courtroom, she was flanked by Victor, Bill, Maria, and several other neighbors. They had all come to support her, and their presence gave her strength. The hearing was intense. Eleanor presented the evidence of the HOA's forgery and manipulation, and the judge was clearly appalled. Richard Thompson tried to defend the HOA's actions, but his arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. In the end, the judge ruled in Maria's favor once again. He not only dismissed the HOA's claims against her, but also ordered a full investigation into the organization's practices. The ruling was a major victory, not just for Maria, but for everyone on Maplewood Lane. The investigation into the HOA uncovered a web of corruption and abuse. Richard Thompson and several other board members were forced to resign, and the organization was placed under new leadership. The new board promised transparency and accountability, but many residents were skeptical. In the months that followed, the HOA's power began to wane. Many residents chose to leave, tired of the constant battles and harassment. The once thriving neighborhood became a shadow of its former self, with empty houses and overgrown lawns. Maria watched it all with mixed emotions. She was glad to see the HOA's reign of terror come to an end, but she couldn't help but feel sad for the community she had once called home. Maria's life in her new neighborhood was peaceful, but she never forgot the lessons she had learned on Maplewood Lane. She became an advocate for homeowners' rights, speaking at conferences and writing articles about her experiences. She even helped start a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting people who were fighting abusive HOAs. As she stood in her new garden one sunny afternoon, Maria felt a sense of contentment. She had been through so much, but she had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. The battle for Maplewood Lane had changed her life, but it had also given her a new purpose. She knew there would always be challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them. She had found her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Years later, Maria returned to Maplewood Lane for a reunion with her old neighbors. The street had changed, some of the houses had been renovated, and new families had moved in, but the sense of community was still there. As she walked down the street, she saw Victor tending to his garden, Bill and Maria sitting on their porch, and Mr. Johnson sharing stories with a group of children. It was a bittersweet moment, but Maria felt a sense of pride. They had all been through so much together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The battle for Maplewood Lane had been long and difficult, but it had also brought them together. And as Maria looked out at the street she had once called home, she knew that their fight had not been in vain. They had stood up for what was right, and they had made a difference. And that, she realized, was the true victory. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.